The road stretched long and empty beneath the glow of the evening sky, the last streaks of pink fading into the deep blue of night. Elon Musk adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, his fingers tapping lightly as he tried to ignore the insistent growl of his stomach. It had been an exhausting day, meetings, calls, factory visits, one of those days where time blurred and meals were forgotten. He could have flown home in his jet, but his assistant, Madison, had suggested something different this time. "You should see more of Real America," she had said. "Take the road trip, feel the miles under you. It'll do you good." Now, nearly 9 p.m. and somewhere in the middle of nowhere, he wasn't sure it had been the best idea. The town of Fairview appeared ahead, tucked into the landscape like something out of an old postcard. Brick buildings, slanted rooftops, a single traffic light blinking yellow over a quiet street. It had the look of a place that had once thrived, maybe 50 years ago, before industries moved away and people followed. As he slowed down, scanning for an open place to eat, his hopes dimmed. The windows of most stores were dark, neon closed signs glowing in doorways. But then, at the end of the street, he saw it, Betty's Diner. The name was painted in big red letters on a sign that looked like it had been there for decades. The windows were lit up, and inside, the place looked full. Elon pulled into an empty spot near the entrance and shut off the engine. A sigh of relief left him as he stepped out into the cool night air. The smell hit him before he even reached the door, something rich, buttery, and warm. His mouth watered at the thought of a good, home-cooked meal. A bell jingled as he pushed open the door, and for a moment, he just stood there, taking it in. The place had a lived-in feel, checkered tablecloths, walls covered in old framed photos, a counter lined with chrome stools. The sound of conversation and laughter filled the air, blending with the clink of silverware against plates. People were packed into booths and tables, their faces easy, their shoulders relaxed. It was the kind of place where people didn't just eat, they gathered, talked, stayed a while. At the center of it all stood a woman in her 60s, wiping her hands on a blue apron embroidered with Betty's Diner. Her gray hair was tied back neatly, and her sharp eyes took in everything at once: the customers, the empty glasses, the sizzling griddle in the kitchen. When she turned toward him, she gave a polite, if somewhat tired, smile. "Evening," she said, tucking her notepad into her apron pocket. "Table for one?" "Yes," Elon said, glancing at an open stool at the counter. "I can sit right there." Betty shook her head. "That one's reserved." "Reserved?" Elon blinked. "It's a diner." She nodded toward a list she had clipped to a wooden board. "Got a wait list. We're full up, at least a 2-hour wait for a table." Elon hesitated. He wasn't used to hearing no. Maybe she didn't recognize him. That happened sometimes when he was away from the big cities. But when people did recognize him, things changed, seats were found, menus brought quickly, chefs called from the back. He pulled off his baseball cap and leaned in slightly. "I'm Elon Musk." The reaction didn't come. Betty just squinted at him, as if trying to place the name. "Elon Musk," he repeated. "Tesla. SpaceX. I'm trying to get people to Mars." Recognition flickered in her eyes, but it wasn't the usual look of surprise or admiration. She just gave a small nod. "Oh, you're the rocket guy," she said. "My grandson talks about you." Elon smiled, expecting the usual follow-up, a request for a selfie, a free meal, a seat made available right now. But instead, Betty just pointed to the clipboard. "Well, Mr. Musk, you can be the rocket guy waiting 2 hours for a table, or you can be the rocket guy trying the burger joint by the highway. Here, everybody waits their turn." Elon stared at her. He wasn't sure what shocked him more, that she wasn't impressed, or that she truly wasn't going to make an exception. "But I can see an open seat right there," he said, trying again. "I've had a long day. I just need a quick meal, and I'll be on my way." Betty didn't budge. "Rules are rules." A ripple of laughter came from a nearby table. Some of the customers had started listening in. "Sorry, fella," an older man called from his booth. "You should have called ahead like the rest of us." Elon felt heat creep up his neck. He wasn't embarrassed often. He had faced interviews, scrutiny, public failures, but something about this moment unsettled him. "I don't think you understand," he said, lowering his voice. "I could buy this diner." Betty raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "That right? I could buy the whole town." The words left his mouth before he fully thought them through. He didn't mean it as a threat, just a statement of fact. Betty just sighed, reaching for her pen and notepad. "Well, if you do, let me know if you want the breakfast special to come with hash browns or grits." More laughter rose from the tables. Someone muttered, "I like this lady." Elon's stomach growled again, but his pride wouldn't let him stay. He had never been turned away like this before. It wasn't about the food anymore, it was about the principle of it. "Fine," he said, adjusting his cap. "I'll go somewhere else." "All right," Betty said, already turning her attention to another customer. "Have a good night now." Elon walked out, the bell jingling behind him. He sat in his car, staring at the neon glow of the diner's sign. Unbelievable. In Los Angeles or New York, restaurant owners would have cleared a whole section just for him. He'd been given private dining rooms, entire floors of restaurants empty just because he walked in. But here, he was just another guy in line. He pulled up a map on his phone. The burger place by the highway was closed for renovations. The gas station on the edge of town had a display of sandwiches that looked like they'd been sitting there for a month. With nothing else open, he settled for a bag of chips and a soda. Back at his hotel, he sat on the edge of the bed, eating his makeshift dinner, but it didn't satisfy. It wasn't just about hunger. It was something deeper, something that gnawed at him more than an empty stomach. He picked up his phone and searched for Betty's Diner. The website was simple, old-fashioned. Family owned since 1972. Home cooking just like Grandma used to make. The reviews were glowing. Best apple pie in the state. Betty treats everyone like family. Worth the wait. Elon tossed his empty chip bag into the trash and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. Everybody waits their turn. When was the last time someone had treated him like just another guy? When was the last time someone had told him no and meant it? He couldn't remember. The more he thought about it, the more restless he became. He should be focused on tomorrow's meetings, reviewing reports, catching up on emails. Instead, all he could think about was a little diner, the people inside, and a woman who hadn't cared who he was. His fingers hovered over his phone screen. I could buy that place right now. But he didn't want to own it. He wanted to understand it. Elon Musk closed his eyes, but he already knew sleep wouldn't come easily. Something about that diner wasn't done with him yet. The night was long, and sleep didn't come easy for Elon Musk. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling of his modest hotel room, the faint hum of the air conditioner filling the silence. The bag of chips he'd eaten earlier sat heavy in his stomach, but it wasn't just hunger keeping him awake. It was that diner. Betty's Diner. The place where he'd been turned away like any other man off the street. The place that hadn't cared who he was. It wasn't anger that filled him, it was something stranger, something unfamiliar. A curiosity that wouldn't let go. Elon rolled onto his side and picked up his phone, his fingers tapping the screen. He pulled up the diner's website again. It was as simple as they came. No flashy design, no fancy promotions, just a single-page layout with a few pictures and a short history. Family owned since 1972. Home-cooked meals made with care. A place where everyone is welcome and everybody waits their turn. That last line stuck with him. He couldn't shake it. He had spent his life moving past lines, skipping waits, walking through doors that opened simply because of his name. But in this tiny town, at this small diner, none of that had mattered. He scrolled further. The reviews were glowing. The best pancakes I've ever had, just like my grandma used to make. Betty's Diner isn't just a place to eat. It's the heart of this town. Come hungry. Come with patience. It's worth every minute. Elon closed his phone and sat up. There was something here. Something he didn't understand yet. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and rubbed his face. He wasn't going to sleep, not with this buzzing in his mind. There was only one way to satisfy his curiosity. He grabbed his jacket and headed out. The streets of Fairview were dark and still. A few porch lights glowed from small homes, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once before settling back down. The town was quiet in the way only small towns could be, peaceful, yet heavy with stories beneath the surface. Elon found himself drawn toward Main Street, where Betty's Diner sat, dark and silent, its closed sign hanging in the window. He stood across the street, staring at it. What was it about this place? What made it different from the thousands of other diners scattered across the country? He looked up and down the street. A barbershop with a faded red and white pole. A general store with shelves visible through the front window, stocked with canned goods and household items. A bakery, its sign slightly tilted, advertising fresh baked pies daily. Everything about this town spoke of a different era, one that hadn't quite caught up with the rest of the world. Elon walked slowly, taking in the details. The cracked sidewalks. The streetlights that buzzed faintly. The old benches outside the post office, worn smooth by years of people sitting, waiting, talking. He reached a bulletin board mounted outside the general store, covered in pinned-up notices. Some were yellowed with age. Others were newer, their edges curling slightly in the night breeze. Yard sale, Saturday, 8 a.m. Lost cat, answers to whiskers. Call Margaret at 555-2121. Community potluck, bring a dish, bring a friend. Prayers needed for the Miller family, thank you, Fairview, for your kindness. He skimmed through them, feeling something tighten in his chest. This was a town that still held on to something rare. It wasn't about business. It wasn't about technology. It was about people. Elon glanced back at Betty's Diner. That must have been why it mattered so much. He checked his watch, almost 2 a.m. He should go back to the hotel. He had things to do tomorrow. But he knew himself well enough to know that the moment he got back into bed, his mind would keep circling back to this place. He turned on his heel and walked back toward his car, making a silent decision. Tomorrow, he would find out everything he could about this town. About the diner. About the people who lived here. And most importantly, why it mattered so much. The sun was just beginning to rise when Elon parked his car outside the Fairview Public Library. It was a small brick building, its windows framed with flower boxes filled with colorful blooms. A wooden sign out front read Fairview Public Library, EST 1928. Inside, the space smelled of books and old paper, with shelves lining the walls and a few wooden tables scattered in the center. An older woman with silver hair sat behind the front desk, peering at him over her reading glasses. "Good morning," she said, setting down the book she'd been flipping through. "Can I help you find something?" Elon hesitated for only a second before stepping forward. "I'm looking for information about the town. And about Betty's Diner." The librarian raised an eyebrow but didn't question him. She motioned toward a section near the back. "We've got some old town records and newspaper archives over there. Anything specific you're looking for?" He glanced at the shelves, at the neatly labeled folders, and shrugged. "History, I guess. I just want to understand the place." The woman studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "That's a good reason to read," she said. "Fairview's got a long history. Not as grand as some places, but important in its own way." She led him to a section filled with old newspaper clippings and town documents. "Betty's Diner used to be called Charlie's Cafe before Betty took over," she said, pulling a yellowed newspaper from a stack. "That place has been feeding folks in this town for over 50 years. Elon took the paper and scanned the article. A photograph showed a younger Betty, her hair darker, her apron just as crisp, standing in front of the diner's familiar red sign. When Charlie Wilson decided to retire, longtime waitress Betty Carter stepped in to buy the place, keeping the doors open and the coffee hot. Elon ran his fingers over the faded print. Betty had been more than just a diner owner, she had saved the place. He read further, discovering more about Fairview. It had once been a thriving manufacturing town, with a furniture factory that employed most of its residents. But when the factory shut down 20 years ago, jobs disappeared and people started moving away. Businesses closed. The town shrank. But not Betty's diner. It had held on. She never let it close, the librarian said softly, as if reading his thoughts. Even when things got tough. When people couldn't pay, she'd still feed them. She always said that as long as the diner was open, Fairview still had a fighting chance. Elon swallowed, feeling something stir deep inside him. He thought about his own world, about how everything he did was about moving forward, pushing limits, thinking of the next big thing. But here was a woman who had spent decades standing still, holding the line, making sure something remained when everything else around it disappeared. He looked up at the librarian. Has the town ever tried to help her? Raise money or anything? The woman smiled sadly. We do what we can, but people here don't have much to give. And Betty, well, she'd never asked for help. She's stubborn as they come. If she's struggling, she keeps it to herself. Elon nodded, absorbing every word. As he stepped out of the library and back onto the quiet street, he looked once more toward the diner in the distance. Now, he understood why it had gotten under his skin. Because it wasn't just a diner. It was Fairview itself. A place that refused to quit. A place that stood, even when everything around it had fallen. And now, he had to decide what to do with that knowledge. Elon Musk wasn't one to walk away from a challenge. And he sure as hell wasn't about to start now. Elon sat in his hotel room long after the sun had gone down, the soft hum of the air conditioner the only sound breaking the silence. His laptop screen cast a dim glow on his face as he stared at the notes he'd scribbled down throughout the day. Fairview wasn't just a town, it was a story. A story of resilience, of people holding on against the odds. And at the heart of it was Betty's Diner. He had seen towns like this before, places that had once thrived before time and change left them behind. But there was something different about this one. He felt it in the way people talked to each other, and the way they gathered at the diner like it was more than a restaurant. It was their home. Elon leaned back in his chair, rubbing his hands together. He'd spent his life solving impossible problems, sending rockets to space, building electric cars, tunneling under cities. But this wasn't about technology. It was about people. And now, he had to figure out how to save their town without them even knowing it was him. The idea settled in his mind, solid and unshakable. He wasn't going to throw money at it and walk away. That wasn't the answer. He needed to revive Fairview the right way, from the inside out. He pulled out his phone and made his first call. Madison, he said, his voice low. I need your help. His assistant's voice was groggy, he had forgotten about the time difference. Elon, it's nearly midnight, she mumbled. I know, he said. I need to set up something big. And I need to do it fast. There was a pause. Then a sigh. What's the plan? Elon glanced toward the window, where the neon Betty's Diner sign still glowed in the distance. We're going to fix a town, he said. The next morning, he drove back to Main Street. The town was just waking up, shop owners flipping signs from closed to open, a few early risers chatting outside the bakery with steaming cups of coffee in their hands. Betty's Diner was already bustling. He could see people filling up the booths, Betty herself pouring coffee behind the counter. It felt like a scene out of a different time, untouched by the rush of the modern world. But he knew better now. He knew the cracks beneath the surface, the diner's failing equipment, the unpaid bills, the town struggles that no one wanted to talk about. He walked past the diner without going in. Instead, he crossed the street and stepped into the town's small bank. A man in his late 50s sat behind the main desk, glasses perched on the end of his nose as he flipped through a stack of papers. When he saw Elon, he blinked in surprise. "Can I help you?" he asked, setting down his pen. Elon sat down across from him. "You're Mr. Jenkins, right? Manager of the bank?" "That's me," the man said cautiously. "And you are?" Elon hesitated for half a second before deciding honesty was best. "Elon Musk." Mr. Jenkins stared at him. Then he let out a short laugh. "All right," he said, clearly thinking it was a joke. Elon pulled off his cap and leaned forward. "I'm serious," he said, his voice even. "And I'd like to talk about some business." Jenkins studied him for a long moment, then cleared his throat. "All right, Mr. Musk. What kind of business?" Elon glanced around, then lowered his voice. "I want to buy some property in Fairview. And I want to help clear some debts, quietly." The banker frowned. "And why would a billionaire care about a small town like ours?" Elon folded his hands. "Because it deserves a second chance." For the next few hours, Elon dug into the town's financial situation. The old furniture factory that had once been the town's biggest employer had been abandoned for over a decade. The owner had passed away, and his family had no interest in keeping the property. It was sitting there, waiting for something to happen. Then there was the diner. Betty never talked about it, but the bank statements told the story. She was behind on payments, struggling to keep the place running, stubborn enough not to ask for help even when she needed it most. Elon made his decision. "I'll take the factory," he told Mr. Jenkins. "And I want to clear the debts on the diner. But you can't tell anyone where the money is coming from." Jenkins looked at him, stunned. "You're serious?" "Very." Jenkins hesitated. "Betty will never accept charity." "It's not charity," Elon said. "It's an investment." By the time he walked out of the bank, Elon had set things in motion. But that was just phase one. He needed people. Experts. Planners. Teams who could move quickly. He made calls all afternoon, his phone pressed to his ear as he paced his hotel room. "I need architects," he said to one contact. "Engineers. Contractors. People who can work fast, but keep quiet." His people were used to big projects, factories, space programs, infrastructure. But this was something different. Something smaller. More human. Within hours, the pieces started falling into place. And by nightfall, Fairview's future had begun to change. The next day, Elon walked into Betty's diner like any other customer. It was mid-morning, and the breakfast rush had passed. The place was quieter now, the air still thick with the scent of bacon and fresh coffee. Betty looked up as he stepped inside, her expression unreadable. "Back again," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Figured I'd give it another try," Elon said, sliding onto a stool at the counter. She smirked. "Well, you still gotta wait your turn. I wouldn't expect anything else." She poured him a cup of coffee without asking, then leaned against the counter. "So what's a man like you doing in Fairview, anyway?" Elon stirred his coffee, thinking. "Looking for something," he said finally. "And did you find it?" He lifted his eyes to hers. "Not yet," he said. "But I think I'm getting close." Over the next week, Fairview changed. It started quietly. Contractors arrived, checking out the old furniture factory. People whispered about it, wondering if someone was finally going to tear it down. Then came the trucks, rolling in with equipment, workers, supplies. The town watched as the impossible happened right before their eyes. The abandoned factory, once a symbol of Fairview's decline, was coming back to life. And inside Betty's diner, Betty noticed something else. One morning, she opened her mail to find a letter from the bank. Her hands trembled slightly as she read it. Her debt was cleared. The diner was safe. She frowned, staring at the paper. It made no sense. And then, as if on cue, Elon Musk walked through the door. She looked up at him, her sharp eyes narrowing. "You," she said. Elon paused, his coffee halfway to his lips. "Me?" Betty folded her arms. "You had something to do with this, didn't you?" Elon took a sip of his coffee and shrugged. "Maybe," he said. Betty huffed, shaking her head. "You don't just waltz into a town and fix things like some fairy tale." "No," Elon agreed. "But sometimes, all a town needs is a little push in the right direction." She studied him for a long time. Then, finally, she sighed. "Well," she said, "if you think this means you get a free meal, you're dead wrong." Elon grinned. Wouldn't expect anything else. And as he sat there, sipping his coffee, he realized something. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about the next big thing. He was thinking about this town. And he wasn't done yet. The first signs of change in Fairview weren't loud or flashy. They came quietly, like the first rays of morning light stretching across the horizon, slow but certain. At first, people hardly noticed. A few more trucks rolling into town. Workers in hard hats walking the perimeter of the old factory, measuring, talking, making notes. The place had been empty for so long that most folks assumed it was just another attempt that would go nowhere. But then, something different happened. The rusted chain-link fence surrounding the factory was torn down. The crumbling front entrance, with its faded sign that still read Fairview Furniture Company, EST 1952, was stripped away, revealing the sturdy brick beneath. And one morning, before the sun was fully up, the deep rumble of machinery filled the air. Elon Musk stood at a distance, hands in his pockets, watching as the work began. It wasn't often that he saw a project come to life in such a small, personal way. Usually, his ventures were massive, spanning countries, involving teams of thousands. But this was different. This was a town getting a second chance. He turned as a pickup truck rolled to a stop beside him. Mayor Bill Grady stepped out, his worn leather boots hitting the pavement with a familiar thud. "I thought you were just passing through," Bill said, watching the workers haul in equipment. "Didn't expect you to start rebuilding half the town." Elon smiled. "I don't do things halfway." Bill let out a short laugh. "No, I suppose you don't." He adjusted his hat and looked back at the factory. "Folks are talking. They're curious." "They should be," Elon said. "This place is about to become something new." The mayor nodded, his face unreadable. "They'll want to know why." Elon hesitated. That was the part he hadn't quite figured out yet, how much to tell, how much to keep quiet. He wanted Fairview to rebuild itself, not lean on the idea of a billionaire swooping in to save the day. "Tell them it's a business opportunity," he said finally. "A smart investment." Bill gave him a look. "You don't need to be here for smart investments. You could have sent a team, bought the land, never set foot in Fairview again. But you didn't. You're here." Elon turned to face the diner across the street. He could see Betty moving behind the counter, pouring coffee, talking with customers. "Maybe I needed a reminder of what real things look like," he said. The mayor studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right," he said. "Let's see what you've got planned." As the days passed, the town's quiet curiosity turned into something else, hope. At the diner, conversation started shifting. "Did you hear?" Mrs. Tate said, stirring sugar into her coffee. "They're putting in new windows at the factory. Big ones. Like they're expecting people to actually work in there again." Across from her, Dale Peterson nodded. "Saw 'em tearing up the parking lot, too. Looks like they're repaving it." Betty listened as she refilled a cup at the counter. People didn't say it out loud, but she could feel it in the air, something was changing. And it wasn't just the factory. One morning, she stepped out onto Main Street to find a crew fixing the potholes that had been in front of her diner for years. The sidewalk, cracked from decades of weather and wear, was suddenly being repaired. The streetlights, which had always flickered weakly at night, were replaced with new bulbs that lit up the town in a way it hadn't been in a long time. At first, people didn't know what to make of it. "I thought the town was broke," someone said. "We are," Bill Grady admitted. "But apparently, we've got new investors." And the biggest surprise came one Sunday afternoon when Betty walked out behind her diner and found a brand new industrial freezer being unloaded. "What in the world?" she muttered, stepping forward. The delivery driver grinned. "Betty Carter? That's me. Got a work order here. New freezer, upgraded stoves, some updated kitchen equipment, all paid for." Betty narrowed her eyes. "By who?" The driver shrugged. "Just says private investor." She knew exactly who it was. Later that evening, as the dinner rush slowed down, Elon walked through the door. Betty was waiting for him. "All right, Musk," she said, hands on her hips. "You gonna tell me what you're up to?" Elon sat at the counter, picking up the menu even though he already knew what he wanted. "Just trying to make sure Fairview has a future." She gave him a skeptical look. "Most people with your kind of money don't think twice about towns like this." "Maybe they should." She studied him, her sharp eyes softening just a little. "I don't like debts, Mr. Musk." "There are no debts," he said. "Just possibilities." She sighed and shook her head, pouring him a cup of coffee. "You're something else, you know that?" "I get that a lot." The changes kept coming, and with them, so did the jobs. One by one, Fairview's people started finding work again. It started with the factory. Once the basic repairs were done, hiring began. At first, it was just a few former workers who had spent years doing nothing, suddenly being called back. Then more positions opened. And then, one morning, a sign went up outside the old high school. "Fairview Technical Training Center, coming soon." It spread through town like wildfire. "They're opening a school," Mrs. Tate told Betty at the diner. "For what?" "For people to learn new trades," she said. "So they can work at the factory. They're saying there's going to be courses on welding, machine operation, even some business classes." Betty stirred her coffee, a slow smile creeping onto her face. "Well, I'll be." Fairview wasn't just surviving anymore. It was growing. But no change came without resistance. Not everyone trusted what was happening. "It's too fast," old Mr. Richardson said at the barbershop. "Nothing good happens this quick." Others worried it wouldn't last. "What if it's just another false hope?" a woman at the bakery whispered. "What if this Musk fella leaves, and it all falls apart?" And Betty, well, she still wasn't sure how to feel about it all. One evening, after the dinner rush had died down, she found herself wiping down the counter, lost in thought. The diner was busier than ever. Families were coming in again. People had money to spend. There was laughter, conversation, life. And yet, something still gnawed at her. Elon was sitting at the far end of the counter, his plate empty, a cup of coffee in front of him. She walked over, setting down a fresh napkin. "All right," she said. "I need to know." He looked up. "Know what?" "Why?" she asked, folding her arms. "Why are you really doing all this?" Elon was quiet for a long moment. Then he took a slow sip of his coffee, set the cup down, and looked her in the eye. "Because I sat right here a few weeks ago, and you didn't care who I was," he said. "Because you treated me like everyone else. And I realized how rare that is." Betty frowned. "That's it?" "No," Elon admitted. "It's also because this town deserves a second chance. And because I know what it's like to have to start over." She studied him, and for the first time, she saw something beneath all the money, all the power. A man who had spent his life building things, but maybe never had a place where he felt at home. She exhaled and shook her head. "Well," she said, pouring him another cup of coffee. "Guess you'd better see this through, then." Elon smiled. "I intend to." The night air was crisp as Elon stepped out of the diner, the warmth of the evening rush still clinging to his clothes. The Neon Betty's Diner sign buzzed faintly above him, casting a soft red glow onto the pavement. He paused, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets, his breath visible in the cool autumn air. The town had changed so much in just a few weeks. The streets were busier now. Storefronts that had once been empty had new signs, new lights, new life. The old factory, once a rusting skeleton of the past, was humming with activity again. People had hope in their eyes. It should have been enough. But something kept nagging at him, a feeling he couldn't shake. He had done what he set out to do. He had given Fairview a second chance. And yet, Fairview wasn't done with him. He didn't know why. Not yet. He walked down the quiet street, past the general store and the little bakery, where the scent of fresh pies lingered in the air even at this hour. His feet carried him without thought, his mind pulling at the edges of a memory he couldn't quite reach. It had started with the pie. The first time he tasted it, something had stirred inside him. A familiar sweetness, a warmth that went beyond flavor. It had triggered something deep, something old. He had told himself it was nothing. Just a feeling, a coincidence. But he didn't believe in coincidences. Something about this town wasn't just business anymore. Something about Fairview was personal. And he had to find out why. The next morning, he found himself back at the library. It was early, the smell of fresh coffee still hanging in the air as the librarian, Margaret Parker, stacked books onto the shelves. She looked up when she saw him, her silver hair tucked neatly into a bun, her sharp eyes twinkling with quiet curiosity. Well, she said, setting down a book. "Didn't think I'd see you back here." Elon gave a small smile. "Didn't think I'd be back either." She wiped her hands on her sweater and gestured toward the same corner he had visited last time. "More Fairview history?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. But something specific this time." Margaret tilted her head. "All right. What are you looking for?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "Do you have any old photographs of the town? Maybe from the 80s or 90s? She raised an eyebrow. "That's pretty specific. Any reason?" He wasn't sure how to explain it. "Just a hunch." Margaret studied him for a moment, then nodded and motioned for him to follow. She led him to a small wooden filing cabinet in the back of the room. "Town archives," she said, pulling open a drawer. Most of these came from donations over the years. Folks who moved away but didn't want to throw their history out. She flipped through folders, then pulled out a thick manila envelope and handed it to him. "This should have what you're looking for." Elon took it and walked to a nearby table. He opened the envelope carefully, his fingers brushing against old, worn photographs. Fairview in its prime. The furniture factory standing tall, the parking lot full. A parade down Main Street, children waving flags. A diner, before it was Betty's, a different name on the sign. He stopped. His breath caught. He knew that sign. It wasn't just familiar. It was personal. His hands tightened around the photo as something deep in his memory cracked open. He remembered a road trip. A long drive across the country. His father at the wheel, his mother in the passenger seat, flipping through a map. A small town, somewhere in the middle of nowhere, where they had stopped for lunch. The diner had been busy, the seats full. They had sat at the counter, right by the register. He had ordered apple pie. His mother had smiled at him as he took his first bite. "Best you ever had?" she had asked. And he had nodded, his mouth too full to speak, the taste sinking into his memory forever. His hands trembled slightly as he stared down at the photograph. He had been here before. As a child. In this very town. He had eaten at this diner, at this counter. He closed his eyes, the weight of the realization settling over him like a heavy quilt. Fairview wasn't just some random town he had chosen to help. It was a place he had been before, long ago, in a moment he had forgotten until now.